Conclusion: Making Peace with Reality. There is a particular moment in spiritual development when the question changes. At the beginning, consciousness often asks, "What is wrong with reality?" Later, it may ask, "What is wrong with me?" And eventually, a deeper question becomes possible. What is reality actually doing? This book has explored one possible answer. Perhaps reality is not fundamentally a prison. Perhaps existence is not a cosmic accident in which consciousness has somehow become trapped inside an indifferent or hostile universe. Perhaps the structures that appear restrictive are participating in something far more intricate. Perhaps limitation has a function. Perhaps karma has a function. Perhaps friction has a function. Perhaps even the forces traditionally interpreted as cosmic adversaries have a function. The central proposition of this book has never been that this interpretation must be believed. It can be examined. What happens when the prison metaphor is turned around? What happens when karma is understood as correspondence rather than punishment? What happens when archons are understood as administrators rather than jailers? What happens when limitation is understood as structure rather than cruelty? What happens when suffering becomes information rather than evidence that existence is against us? The entire relationship between consciousness and reality changes. From prison to curriculum. The prison metaphor begins with an assumption. Something has gone wrong. The curriculum metaphor begins somewhere else. Something is developing. That distinction may appear subtle, but it changes the entire philosophical architecture. A prison is designed to prevent freedom. A curriculum is designed to develop capacity. A prison explains boundaries through punishment or control. A curriculum explains boundaries through function. A prison produces an enemy. A curriculum produces a lesson. When reality is interpreted as a prison, the natural spiritual response becomes escape. Find the jailer. Expose the system. Break the walls. Defeat the archons. Escape the matrix. Leave the world behind. But if reality functions as a curriculum, these same actions may represent a misunderstanding of the structure. The boundary may exist because consciousness has not yet developed the capacity to move beyond it. The restriction may be instructional. The friction may be developmental. The experience may be precisely what exposes a limitation that consciousness cannot yet see. This does not mean that every unpleasant experience is secretly desirable. It does not mean injustice should be tolerated. It does not mean discernment should disappear. The curriculum model does not require passivity. It requires a different interpretation of what limitation means. A boundary can be opposed when appropriate. A harmful condition can be changed. A destructive relationship can be left. An unjust system can be challenged. But none of these actions require the conclusion that existence itself is malicious. That distinction allows consciousness to act without becoming consumed by opposition. It allows resistance to remain an action rather than becoming an identity, and that is a profound form of freedom. Karma without punishment. The same transformation occurs when karma is reconsidered. If karma is imagined as a cosmic ledger, existence becomes judicial. Somewhere, an invisible authority records actions. Rewards are assigned. Punishments are assigned. Debts accumulate. Debts are repaid. Consciousness moves through existence attempting to balance an account it cannot see. This creates a fundamentally moralistic relationship with reality. But karma can be understood differently. Karma can be understood as correspondence. Action interacts with structure. Intention interacts with consciousness. Consciousness interacts with circumstance. Circumstance produces experience. Experience produces feedback. Feedback modifies consciousness, and the modified consciousness encounters future circumstances differently. The process does not require a cosmic judge. It requires lawful relationship. This is why karma in this framework is not primarily something to fear. It is something to understand. If a pattern repeatedly appears, consciousness can examine the pattern. If a reaction repeatedly produces the same consequence, consciousness can examine the reaction. If attachment repeatedly produces suffering, consciousness can examine attachment. If fear repeatedly narrows perception, consciousness can examine fear. The purpose is not to ask, what punishment have I earned? The purpose is to ask, what correspondence is being revealed? That question changes karma from a threat into an instrument of understanding. The karmic process becomes educational. And once the lesson is understood, the need for repetition can diminish. This is why liberation does not require escaping karma as though karma were an external enemy. It requires understanding the structures through which karma operates. When the structure changes, the correspondence changes. The archons reconsidered. The same principle applies to the archons. The image of the archon as a cosmic jailer is powerful because it gives limitation a face. There is someone doing this. There is someone preventing humanity from awakening. There is someone maintaining the prison. But the older meaning of the word points toward administration and rulership. This creates another possibility. Perhaps the administrator is not the enemy. Perhaps administration is necessary because consciousness is developing within a structured reality. A boundary can preserve a lesson. A limitation can preserve developmental integrity. A restriction can prevent premature access. A karmic mechanism can maintain correspondence between consciousness and experience. Within this model, the archonic principle becomes something closer to cosmic administration. The administrator maintains order. The administrator does not necessarily determine the destination. The administrator maintains the conditions through which the curriculum operates. This makes the archons neither inherently good nor inherently evil. They become functional, and functionality is a more useful lens than moral projection. A storm is not evil because it destroys something. A boundary is not evil because it prevents movement. Gravity is not evil because it prevents flight. Likewise, a cosmic restriction would not automatically be evil simply because consciousness experiences it as limitation. The question is always, what function does it serve? That question takes us beyond mythology and toward philosophy. Limitation was never the enemy. One of the deepest conclusions of the curriculum model is that limitation may have been misunderstood from the beginning. We often imagine freedom as the absence of boundaries, but without boundaries, meaningful development becomes difficult to define. A child develops within physical limitations. A student develops within intellectual limitations. An apprentice develops within technical limitations. A musician develops through the limitations of an instrument. A yogin develops through disciplined limitations of conduct, attention, and practice. Structure does not necessarily oppose freedom. Structure can create the conditions in which freedom becomes meaningful. The human incarnation itself is defined by limitation. A particular body, a particular mind, a particular lifespan, a particular family, a particular culture, a particular historical period, a particular set of capacities, a particular set of karmic tendencies. Consciousness enters a highly specific configuration. From the perspective of absolute infinity, this may appear restrictive. From the perspective of learning, it is extraordinarily precise. The limitation creates the lesson. The lesson creates the experience. The experience creates the possibility of recognition. Recognition creates understanding. Understanding changes consciousness, and consciousness eventually becomes capable of functioning beyond the original limitation. The boundary was therefore not necessarily preventing development, it was enabling it. Friction was education. This also changes the meaning of suffering. Suffering remains. Pain does not become pleasant merely because it may contain information. Loss remains loss. Grief remains grief. Failure remains failure. But the existence of difficulty does not necessarily mean that existence has failed. Friction may reveal where consciousness is unable to move freely. It exposes attachment, it exposes fear, it exposes identification, it exposes expectation, it exposes the distance between what consciousness believes reality should be and what reality actually is. This makes friction diagnostic. The friction tells us where the structure is catching. And when the structure becomes visible, it can be understood. This is why some of the most important spiritual developments occur precisely where the individual would prefer development not to occur. The obstacle becomes the teacher. The repetition becomes the message. The discomfort becomes the information. The contradiction becomes the inquiry. The limitation becomes the doorway. Not because suffering is inherently sacred, but because consciousness can learn from what it encounters. And once the lesson has been integrated, the relationship with friction changes. The same circumstance may no longer produce the same reaction. The same trigger may no longer possess the same power. The same pattern may no longer repeat. The external event has not necessarily changed. The consciousness encountering it has. That development. The end of the victim narrative. Perhaps the greatest transformation offered by this framework is the end of the victim narrative. Not because victims do not exist, not because harmful circumstances do not exist, not because injustice does not exist, but because defining consciousness entirely through what has been done to it can become another form of limitation. If every difficulty must have an external enemy, then consciousness remains dependent upon identifying the enemy. If every restriction must be blamed upon the matrix, consciousness remains oriented toward the matrix. If every karmic experience must be blamed upon archons, consciousness remains fascinated with archons. The supposed liberator can remain psychologically bound to the thing it opposes. The victim narrative therefore contains a paradox. It can make consciousness feel powerless while simultaneously giving it an endless external explanation for its powerlessness. The curriculum model offers another path. It asks consciousness to reclaim its participation, not absolute control, not responsibility for everything that happens. Participation. The circumstances may not have been chosen consciously. The conditions may not have been created by the individual, but consciousness still participates in the relationship with those conditions. That relationship can change, perception can change, understanding can change, capacity can change. And when consciousness changes, the experience of reality changes with it. This is radical responsibility without cosmic self-blame. The illusion of choice and the reality of development. The book has also questioned the ordinary understanding of free will. If consciousness can only express through its present capacity, then every action emerges from a particular configuration of awareness. The individual acts according to what is accessible at that moment. Later understanding can make alternative actions visible, but that later understanding did not exist in the earlier configuration. This is why hindsight can create the illusion of a freedom that was not actually accessible at the time. Yet this does not make development meaningless. It makes development the central mechanism of freedom. Every increase in understanding changes what becomes accessible. Every expansion of awareness creates new possibilities. Every integrated lesson alters the structure through which future choices arise. The person does not need to have possessed unlimited freedom yesterday. They need only become more capable today. This provides a more profound definition of agency. Agency is not necessarily the ability to stand outside causation and choose anything whatsoever. Agency is the increasing capacity to participate consciously within causation. The more consciousness understands itself, the more intelligently it can participate. The more clearly it perceives reality, the less it is driven by unconscious reaction. The more integrated it becomes, the wider its field of possible expression. Freedom therefore grows with understanding. Making peace with reality. And so we arrive at the central movement of this book. Making peace with reality does not mean agreeing with everything that happens. It does not mean surrendering discernment. It does not mean becoming passive. It does not mean refusing to challenge what should be challenged. It means ending the assumption that reality must first be defeated before consciousness can be free. The universe need not be viewed as either random chaos or a malicious prison. It can instead be understood as an exquisitely ordered field in which consciousness unfolds according to lawful principles. Within this framework, the archons are not enemies to defeat, but administrators maintaining the integrity of the curriculum. Karma is not punishment, but correspondence. Limitation is not cruelty, but structure. Friction is not failure, but education. The body is not necessarily a cage. The world is not necessarily a trap. Circumstance is not necessarily an enemy. The curriculum is not necessarily something consciousness must escape. It may be the very structure through which consciousness becomes capable of recognizing itself. From limitation to liberation. The title of this book therefore describes a movement rather than a destination. From limitation to liberation. The movement begins with unconscious identification. Consciousness believes itself to be the limitation. Then it begins observing the limitation. It recognizes recurring patterns. It examines perception. It understands karma. It discovers the relationship between capacity and action. It begins to see the function of friction. It stops requiring an enemy. It assumes responsibility for its participation. It integrates the lesson. The pattern dissolves. The boundary becomes transparent. The field expands, and eventually consciousness begins to recognize something deeper. The limitations were real at the level at which they were experienced, but they were never the whole of reality. The body was a limitation. The mind was a limitation. The senses were limitations. The personality was a limitation. The karmic structure was a limitation. Yet each limitation created a specific field through which consciousness could experience, learn, and awaken. The limitation became the instrument of liberation. That is the paradox. The walls were not necessarily there to imprison consciousness forever. They defined the space in which consciousness could develop. And when the development was complete, the walls no longer carried the same meaning. They became thresholds. The final recognition. Perhaps the deepest liberation is therefore not the discovery of how to escape the universe. It is the discovery that the universe never needed to be escaped in the way we imagined. The search for liberation often begins with rejection. Reject the body, reject the world, reject the matrix, reject karma, reject limitation, reject the archons. But eventually rejection itself can become another form of attachment. The seeker remains defined by what they oppose. A deeper path becomes possible when consciousness begins to understand rather than merely reject. Understand the body, understand the mind, understand karma, understand limitation, understand perception, understand the architecture of experience, understand the forces that shape manifestation, understand the curriculum. And through understanding, identification begins to loosen. This is why the final movement is not rebellion, it is recognition. The universe does not have to be perfect according to the preferences of the individual. It has to be understood according to its own nature. The more completely that nature is understood, the less unnecessary conflict consciousness creates with reality. And perhaps this is what the ancient traditions were pointing toward when they spoke of liberation. Not merely going somewhere else, not merely acquiring extraordinary powers, not merely ascending through cosmic geography, but recognizing the nature of consciousness itself. The self does not become free because the universe finally grants permission. The self is recognized as that which was never ultimately confined by the changing conditions through which experience unfolded. The curriculum belongs to becoming. Liberation belongs to recognition. The curriculum continues. Even after this recognition, the world continues. Bodies continue to arise. Lives continue to unfold. Relationships continue. Lessons continue at different levels. The locus remain part of the larger architecture. Karma continues to operate within manifestation. Consciousness continues its movement through experience. The difference is that the relationship with the process has changed. The seeker no longer needs every experience to confirm a worldview. They can simply observe. They no longer need every difficulty to prove that an enemy exists. They can investigate. They no longer need every limitation to mean imprisonment. They can ask what capacity is being developed. They no longer need every karmic pattern to be feared. They can understand correspondence. They no longer need to escape reality in order to feel free. They can discover freedom within understanding. This is the maturation of the curriculum. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. Reality does not have to become less mysterious for consciousness to become more peaceful within it. The universe may remain vast. The locus may remain mysterious. The nature of consciousness may remain beyond complete conceptual capture. The mechanics of karma may remain deeper than any human model can fully describe. The existence and function of subtle intelligences may remain matters of philosophical and spiritual inquiry. None of this prevents understanding. We do not need to possess the final map in order to learn how to walk. The purpose of this book has never been to provide the final map. It has been to offer another way of looking, a way that replaces fear with inquiry, paranoia with discernment, victimhood with participation, punishment with correspondence, restriction with structure, resistance with understanding, and escape with liberation. The door was always the lesson. Perhaps, after everything has been said, the entire journey can be reduced to one final realization. We spent so much time looking for the door out of the prison that we failed to notice what the door was teaching us. Every boundary pointed toward a capacity. Every friction revealed a structure. Every repetition exposed a pattern. Every limitation showed where consciousness could not yet move. Every lesson contained the possibility of its own completion, and every completion opened another field of awareness. The door was never simply an exit. It was an invitation to understand. Once the lesson is integrated, the door opens naturally. There is no need to destroy the wall. There is no need to defeat the administrator. There is no need to wage war against the architecture of existence. The consciousness has changed, and because consciousness has changed, the meaning of the structure changes with it. What was once experienced as confinement becomes context. What was once experienced as punishment becomes feedback. What was once experienced as an enemy becomes part of the order through which development occurred. What was once experienced as a prison becomes a school. And what was once experienced as a school may eventually be recognized as something even greater, a field in which consciousness was given the conditions necessary to remember what it is. That is the movement from limitation to liberation, not escape from reality, understanding of reality, not destruction of the boundaries, transcendence of the identification that made those boundaries feel absolute, not victory over the curriculum, completion of the lesson. And perhaps, at the very end, there is no prison to escape, no jailer to defeat, and no final boundary to cross. There is simply consciousness awakening to itself.